The moment looked ordinary enough. A former central banker speaking carefully about trade incentives and credibility. No shouting, no slogans, no theatrics, and yet something fundamental cracked open in that exchange. Because what Mark Carney did was not criticize a tariff or debate a percentage point. He exposed the assumption holding the entire Trump trade war together, and once you see it, the strategy stops looking tough and starts looking fragile. The assumption was simple, almost elegant in its bluntness, that pressure, once applied hard enough, forces compliance, that allies grumble, markets wobble, executives complain, but eventually everyone folds. It's the worldview of bilateral leverage, not systems, of deals, not institutions, of strength measured by immediate reaction rather than long-term adjustment. And for a while it looked plausible. Markets moved, headlines followed, negotiators flew in and out of Washington. The surface told a story of motion. But Carney was speaking to what happens underneath motion. How institutions absorb stress, how capital reroutes, how governments hedge rather than surrender. And in doing so, he highlighted the mistake that keeps recurring in Trump's approach to economic power, confusing visibility with control. Trade wars feel powerful because they are loud. Tariffs announce themselves. They trigger retaliation lists and angry press conferences. They produce charts that spike, but the actual leverage of a modern economy doesn't reside in the noise. It resides in expectations about rules, stability, and predictability. Carney, having spent years inside the machinery of global finance, understands something politicians often don't. Markets don't respond to threats the way voters do. They don't panic forever. They reposition. What Trump assumed, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, was that the United States could impose pain faster than others could adapt, that the size of the American market would outweigh the patience of trading partners. That asymmetry would translate into obedience, and in narrow cases that logic works. But Carney's point was that the global system isn't built for narrow cases anymore. It's built for redundancy. When tariffs rise, supply chains don't argue. They move. When uncertainty increases, capital doesn't protest. It prices risk and flows elsewhere. When credibility erodes, institutions don't collapse. They quietly reduce exposure. None of this happens on cable news. None of it looks dramatic in the short term. But over time, it compounds. Carney wasn't moralizing. He wasn't defending free trade as an abstract good. He was describing a mechanical reality. Once you teach the world that access to the U.S. market is politically contingent, the rational response is diversification, not defiance, not submission, diversification. And that response weakens the very leverage tariffs are supposed to create. This is where the fatal assumption reveals itself. Trump's trade strategy treated global commerce as a series of standoffs, each resolvable by escalating pressure. Carney treated it as an ecosystem where stress on one node redistributes load across the network. In a standoff, the bigger player wins. In a network, the rigid player loses flexibility. The unsettling part isn't that tariffs failed to deliver some promised outcome. It's that they succeeded in teaching institutions how to operate without relying on American goodwill. That lesson doesn't disappear when a policy changes. It becomes embedded, and this is why Carney's intervention mattered. He wasn't arguing about ideology. He was diagnosing a systems error. When you weaponize access to the core of the global economy, you don't just extract concessions. You incentivize exit strategies. Trump believed pressure would concentrate power. Carney explained why it disperses it. And once you understand that, the trade war stops looking like a show of strength and starts looking like an inadvertent tutorial in how to reduce American centrality without ever losing a single negotiation. What Carney was really doing in that moment was situating Trump's trade war inside a much older institutional story, one that long predates any administration and operates mostly out of sight. To understand why the strategy misfired, you have to step back from personalities and look at how the post-war economic system was designed to behave under stress. After 1945, the United States didn't just build markets, it built expectations. The Bretton Woods institutions, the dollar-based financial system, and later the World Trade Organization were not instruments of constant coercion. They were credibility machines. The power of the system came from the assumption that rules would be boring, predictable, and enforced impersonally. That stability allowed capital to scale, supply chains to stretch, and allies to bind themselves to American-led structures without fearing sudden reversals. Carney, having operated at the center of that system, understands a critical asymmetry. Institutions are slow to form, but extremely fast to adapt once their core assumptions are threatened. Trump's trade war collided with that asymmetry head-on. By treating trade relationships as temporary bargains rather than embedded commitments, the administration challenged not just specific partners, but the logic of institutional trust itself. This is where the historical setup matters. The global economy is no longer a hub-and-spoke system where Washington dictates terms and others comply. It is a dense lattice of overlapping agreements, currency swaps, regional trade blocs, and regulatory harmonization. Power doesn't disappear in such a system, it diffuses. And when pressure is applied unilaterally, the system's instinct is not confrontation, but insulation. Carney's point was that Trump misread how allies perceive risk. Canada, the EU, Japan, and even parts of the American corporate sector don't see tariffs as negotiating tools. They see them as signals that access can be revoked suddenly, signals that political cycles override technical commitments. And once those signals are sent, institutional actors respond in the only rational way available. They reduce dependency. This is why the trade war produced so many quiet, technocratic responses rather than dramatic political ones. Central banks adjusted reserve strategies. Firms rewrote supply contracts. Governments accelerated trade talks elsewhere. None of this required public defiance. It required spreadsheets. Trump's framing assumed a world still governed by Cold War leverage logic, where economic pain translated directly into political capitulation. But Carney was pointing to a post-Cold War reality. Pain is now often cheaper than uncertainty. A tariff is a known cost. An unpredictable partner is an unbounded one. The irony is that the very scale of the U.S. economy, which Trump treated as a blunt instrument, was historically effective because it wasn't wielded bluntly. American centrality depended on being the safest default option, not the most feared one. Institutions gravitated toward the U.S. because it lowered transaction costs, stabilized expectations, and separated politics from process. The trade war blurred that separation. Carney's exposure of the system's logic also explains why the backlash wasn't louder. Institutions don't shout, they hedge, they don't announce exits, they build alternatives quietly. The reaction to Trump's trade strategy was not resistance, but reconfiguration. And this brings us to the deeper setup problem. Trump viewed trade as a zero-sum contest between sovereign actors. Carney described it as a credibility-based system where long-term positioning matters more than short-term wins. One worldview rewards escalation, the other penalizes it over time. That tension between episodic power and structural power is the fault line running through the entire trade war. And it's why the next chapter isn't about what Trump wanted, but about who believed it would work and why that belief persisted far longer than the evidence justified. The miscalculation at the heart of Trump's trade war wasn't impulsiveness. It was confidence, shared by more people than critics like to admit, that modern institutions would behave like older ones under pressure. That belief didn't come out of nowhere. It came from decades of American success in bending systems without breaking them, and that history is precisely what made the mistake so durable. Inside Washington, the logic sounded airtight. The U.S. market was indispensable. The dollar was dominant. American consumers absorbed global production. If tariffs created pain, that pain would land asymmetrically. Trading partners dependent on access would negotiate. This wasn't ideological, it was transactional. And many seasoned officials, business leaders, and even foreign counterparts initially assumed it would work because versions of it had worked before. But those earlier victories occurred in a different institutional environment. Supply chains were shallower, capital mobility was lower, alternative markets were weaker, and crucially, American policy credibility was taken for granted. Trump's team assumed all of that context still held. Carney's exposure was that it didn't. The miscalculation wasn't simply overestimating American leverage, it was misunderstanding the nature of dependence. Trump treated dependence as a static condition. You either rely on the U.S. or you don't. Carney understood it as dynamic. Reliance is constantly renegotiated based on risk. And tariffs, far from increasing dependence, reframed it as a vulnerability. What's striking is how long this error persisted despite mounting evidence. Tariffs didn't collapse foreign economies. They didn't produce sweeping concessions, they didn't force allies into line, yet the strategy doubled down. Why? Because the feedback loop was misleading. Markets didn't crash. GDP numbers didn't implode. There was no dramatic moment of failure. Instead, there was a slow erosion of trust, something political systems are famously bad at measuring. Trump's approach also benefited from a psychological trap. Escalation feels like action. De-escalation feels like retreat. When negotiations stalled, the instinct was to increase pressure, not reassess assumptions. Each tariff round became proof of resolve rather than a test of strategy. The absence of immediate catastrophe was mistaken for validation. Carney's critique cut through that illusion. He pointed out that institutional actors don't respond to pressure the way political adversaries do. They don't internalize threats emotionally, they price them. And once priced, threats lose their coercive force. A tariff becomes just another cost of doing business. An unreliable partner, by contrast, becomes a strategic liability. This is where belief outpaced reality. Trump's circle believed the system had no choice but to yield. Carney showed that the system always has another move. It just doesn't announce it. Firms diversify suppliers, governments deepen regional ties, financial institutions hedge currency exposure. None of this looks like defiance, but cumulatively it neutralizes leverage. The deeper miscalculation was assuming that power could be exercised repeatedly without diminishing returns. Trump treated tariffs as reusable tools. Carney understood them as signals with compounding effects. The first signal forces attention, the 10th teaches avoidance, and perhaps the most revealing error was mistaking silence for submission. When allies didn't retaliate loudly, or did so in measured ways, it was read as weakness. In reality, it was adaptation. Institutions rarely fight the system head-on. They route around it. By the time this became obvious, the architecture had already shifted. Supply chains had adjusted. Trust had thinned. And the leverage Trump expected to accumulate had begun to evaporate. That miscalculation sets the stage for what happened next. Not a dramatic collapse, but a series of quiet institutional reactions that reshaped the landscape while political attention remained elsewhere. What followed the miscalculation was not rebellion. It was something far more consequential: institutional self-protection. Once the signal had been absorbed, the system began to move, not loudly, not symbolically, but methodically. And this is where Trump's trade war became less about tariffs and more about trust. The first reactions weren't political at all. They were bureaucratic. Trade ministries reclassified risk. Central banks revised stress scenarios. Procurement offices rewrote long-term assumptions about supplier reliability. None of this required public confrontation. In fact, confrontation would have been inefficient. Institutions don't push back emotionally. They rebalance structurally. Carney's insight helps explain why this phase was so easy to miss. The absence of crisis headlines created the impression of control. Markets continued functioning. Goods kept moving. Negotiations stayed nominally open. But beneath that continuity, the logic had changed. The United States was no longer treated as a stable constant in economic modeling. It became a variable. Once that shift occurs, behavior follows predictably. Firms accelerate nearshoring or friendshoring, not out of ideology, but because risk committees demand it. Governments fast-track trade agreements that had previously stalled, not to snub Washington, but to insure against it. Financial institutions widen the range of currencies and jurisdictions they're willing to operate in, not to dethrone the dollar, but to reduce exposure to policy volatility. These adjustments didn't require consensus or coordination. They were parallel responses to the same signal, and because they were dispersed, no single actor bore the cost of defiance. That's the structural advantage of institutions in a networked system. Adaptation doesn't look like resistance, but it achieves the same effect. Trump's team seemed to expect visible counterpressure, retaliatory tariffs, nationalist rhetoric, diplomatic standoffs. What they got instead was quiet reallocation, and that quietness mattered because it delayed political recognition of what was happening. You can't hold a press conference about a revised supply chain risk model. You can't tweet about a marginal shift in capital flows, but over time those marginal shifts add up. Carney framed this as a credibility problem, not a trade one. When rules are perceived as contingent on political mood, institutions compensate by lowering reliance. This isn't a judgment about American intentions. It's a rational response to uncertainty. Once the U.S. demonstrated a willingness to weaponize access unpredictably, it forced others to plan as if that behavior might recur. The irony is that the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Post-war economic architecture was built to absorb shocks, distribute stress, and prevent single points of failure. Trump introduced shock deliberately, assuming it would concentrate leverage. Instead, the system dispersed it. The more pressure applied, the faster adaptation accelerated. Even inside the United States, institutional reactions followed the same logic. Companies lobbied less for rollback and more for exemptions. States pursued their own trade relationships. Regulatory agencies quietly adjusted implementation timelines. None of this challenged presidential authority directly. It simply reduced its effectiveness. Carney's exposure of this dynamic made clear that the trade war wasn't being won or lost in the conventional sense. It was being bypassed. The machinery of global commerce was learning how to function with fewer assumptions about American consistency, and that's the key shift. Once institutions stop assuming stability, they stop organizing around it. The center doesn't collapse, but it becomes less central. By the time the political debate caught up, much of the adaptation had already occurred. The leverage Trump expected to wield had been diluted, not by defiance, but by design. Which brings us to the next layer of the story, the consequences no one intended, no one celebrated, and no one could easily reverse. By the time the second-order consequences began to surface, the political argument was already outdated. The debate was still framed around tariffs, retaliation, and leverage, but the real effects were unfolding elsewhere, quietly, unevenly, and without a clear scoreboard. One consequence was temporal. Institutions think in horizons, not cycles. Once diversification begins, it rarely reverses fully. A supplier added as a hedge doesn't disappear when tariffs are lifted. A regional agreement negotiated as insurance doesn't dissolve when uncertainty fades. What Trump's trade war triggered was not a temporary detour, but a layering of alternatives. Redundancy once built becomes normal. Another consequence was reputational, and this is where Carney's exposure cut deepest. Credibility doesn't fail all at once. It thins. Each episode of unpredictability slightly increases the discount rate applied to future commitments. Over time, that discount compounds. Partners still engage, deals still get signed, but margins tighten, trust premiums disappear, and the system subtly prices in caution. There were no obvious winners here. Domestic industries protected by tariffs gained short-term relief, but at the cost of higher input prices and less stable planning environments. Allies avoided open confrontation, but accepted higher transaction costs to reduce exposure. Consumers absorbed diffuse price increases without a clear line of sight to cause. This wasn't a zero-sum redistribution of gains, it was a shared inefficiency introduced into the system. And inefficiency, unlike conflict, doesn't mobilize opposition. It lingers. It spreads thinly enough that no single actor has the incentive to reverse it alone. That's why second-order effects are so politically durable. They don't provoke outrage. They alter baselines. Carney's analysis suggested that the real shift wasn't about trade balances at all. It was about how power operates when credibility erodes incrementally. The United States didn't lose its central role. It lost a degree of its default status, and defaults matter because they shape behavior without requiring constant assertion. Another consequence emerged inside institutions themselves. Risk officers gained influence. Legal departments expanded contingency planning. Boards asked harder questions about political exposure. These internal dynamics matter because they outlast administrations. Once governance structures adjust to assume volatility, they rarely revert to assuming stability. Stability must be re-earned, not merely declared. There was also a strategic consequence that ran counter to Trump's intent. By normalizing the use of trade as a pressure tool, the trade war legitimized similar behavior by others. What had once been seen as exceptional became precedent. That didn't empower the strongest actor indefinitely. It lowered the threshold for everyone. Power became noisier, more fragmented, and harder to coordinate. Perhaps the most revealing second-order effect was emotional, but not in the sentimental sense. It was institutional psychology. Confidence in the system's predictability weakened, not collapsed, just weakened enough to change behavior, and confidence, once shaken, doesn't snap back. It requires sustained consistency. Trump framed the trade war as a test of toughness. Carney reframed it as a test of patience. And patience is where institutions, not politicians, tend to dominate. They don't need to win arguments. They need to survive regimes. By the time these consequences became visible, there was nothing dramatic to point to. No decisive failure, no clear reversal, just a world marginally less organized around American centrality. And marginal shifts are how systems actually change. That leaves the final question. What does this episode reveal about power itself in a world where institutions adapt faster than leaders expect? What this moment ultimately reveals is not the failure of a policy, but the exposure of a misunderstanding about how power functions in an institutional age. Donald Trump treated economic strength as something that could be asserted episodically, applied, withdrawn, reapplied, without altering the structure it operated within. Mark Carney was pointing to a quieter reality. Power that depends on credibility is only effective so long as others believe it will be exercised predictably. This is the divide that defined the trade war. Trump operated on the logic of command. Carney described the logic of consent, not political consent, but institutional reliance. The United States did not dominate global commerce because it could coerce compliance at will. It dominated because it offered the most reliable environment in which others could plan. That reliability functioned like gravity. It didn't need to be enforced. It simply existed. Once gravity weakens, objects don't fly apart dramatically. They drift. The trade war exposed how modern systems respond to drift. Institutions don't protest instability. They arbitrage around it. They don't demand reassurance. They build insulation. And once that insulation exists, restoring centrality becomes far harder than asserting it ever was. This is the asymmetry Trump misread. Pressure is easy to apply. Trust is slow to rebuild. Carney's exposure of the fatal assumption wasn't partisan. It was structural. He wasn't arguing that tariffs are immoral or that globalization must be preserved at all costs. He was explaining that leverage drawn from centrality erodes when centrality itself is made conditional. You cannot repeatedly weaponize access to a system and expect participants to treat that system as neutral. What makes this episode instructive is that nothing visibly collapsed. The dollar remained dominant, trade continued, alliances held, and that's precisely why the lesson is easy to miss. Institutional decay rarely announces itself. It accumulates. It manifests as optionality elsewhere. This is not a story about American decline in the theatrical sense. It's about American influence becoming less automatic, less assumed, more transactional. And transactional power, by definition, requires constant reinforcement. It is louder, costlier, and less efficient than structural power. Trump believed toughness would clarify hierarchies. Instead, it clarified incentives. And incentives, once clarified, shape behavior long after rhetoric fades. Carney understood that the most consequential reactions wouldn't come from foreign leaders seeking headlines, but from committees seeking stability. In that sense, the trade war wasn't a confrontation between nations. It was a stress test of institutional patience, and patience won not because it triumphed, but because it endured. The deeper implication is unsettling for any future leader who believes forceful assertion alone can restore leverage. In a world of adaptive systems, power is exercised less by pressure than by being indispensable. Once indispensability is questioned, strength must work harder to achieve the same effect. That is the exposure Carney delivered, not an attack on a presidency, but a diagnosis of a misaligned strategy in an institutional world. Trump assumed the system would bend, the system assumed he would pass, and in that mismatch the future quietly reorganized itself.